Hi there, and welcome to One Idea Away, not just a podcast, but a community and ongoing conversation meant to inspire and empower individuals to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. Let's jump into today's episode right now. There are times on this show when we've talked about the choices we make. You've heard many stories about how those choices have come while individuals found themselves at that metaphorical crossroads in life, with two roads leading in different futures and different experiences. Well, today I want to introduce you to a slightly different view of what may be going on and how we can navigate through life. How at times, life can be more like walking the high edge of a mountain. And while it may seem precarious, it's also enriching. And with awareness, it can make that way forward very, very clear. Let me just share with you real quickly from our guest's book. Edges are places where opposites meet, where fear meets courage and suffering meets freedom, where solid ground ends in a cliff face, where we gain a view that takes in so much more of our world, and where we need to maintain great awareness lest we trip and fall. With that, I am very honored today to have as our guest Roshi Joan Halifax. Roshi Joan is a Buddhist teacher, Zen priest, anthropologist, and a pioneer in the field of end-of-life care. She's founder, abbot, and head teacher of Upaya Institute and Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She received her Ph.D. in Medical Anthropology in 1973 and has lectured on the subject of death and dying at many academic institutions and medical centers around the world. She's authored several books, and it's her newest book that's our focus today, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet. And it's going to be released May 1st of this year, 2018. Roshi Joan, thank you so much for joining us on One Idea Away.
Thank you, Luke. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. What I'm curious about, to just kind of begin and give everybody a little bit of background on, is to learn a little bit about ultimately what led you to the path that you're on today. As you described, and as I had the chance to look a little bit into your background and story, as you describe it, you were able to grow up during the time of civil rights activism and the anti-war movement. And then you went into anthropology, and then you became an author, and then you opened up this extraordinary center. And I'm just kind of curious a bit of what ultimately led you in this direction and this path in life.
I think that's a wonderful question, Luke. It's never, I think, for any of us who have made unusual choices about their lives, just one thing.
Absolutely.
But I think, a number of things contributed. One was a severe illness as a child where I became blind. The person who took care of me when I was so gravely ill as a child, her mother had been a slave, but she had this quality of openness, of brilliance that really affected me and gave me a sense of appreciation for my own internal life, which became visible to me as a result of being so sick. And then I feel that I, was born in a certain way at a very good time, because when I was in my 20s, it was the 1960s. And so the values and the kind of ethos, the views that were opening up during the 60s really touched my life in a fundamental way and gave me the opportunity to move in a direction that was not so materialistic and consumeristic, but was really in the direction of service.
Outstanding. And it certainly, it's amazing the way in which, as you describe, it's never just one thing. It always is an amalgamation of all of these different experiences and the way in which they interplay, as well as the times and environments in which that we were born in. And I think it's interesting. I love that phrase of getting connected to your internal life, because it as we begin to center in on that internal life and better understand it and be with it and become aware of it, all of a sudden we can hear that inner voice that might be calling us in certain directions a whole lot more clearly than we may hear on a normal day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, Luke, that is kind of interesting is to explore the value of, a difficult experience,
yes,
of a crisis, of a catastrophe, of illness, of loss, in terms of deepening our character and deepening our resolve to end suffering in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of facing adversity and looking through it in so many different ways. And I think this is what was amazing to me with some of what's presented in the book, is the way that even those adversities can connect us to deeper states, help us understand these edges, help us understand things like empathy and compassion and suffering in completely different ways, let alone what it is that it reveals for us, within us, as we go through them. Maybe if we could begin there, of that idea of edges. I was hoping you could maybe elaborate on how you came to choose that term, that metaphor. What is it that edges represents to you, and why that, just stuck out so clearly as a really poignant way to explain these concepts?
Yeah, I think the metaphor is, and needless to say, the metaphor has a kind of geographical root. And part of that is because of my own love of the natural world. But what I have learned about edges is that there is more diversity, a greater capacity to actually see a wider landscape. It allows us to be in a state of radical inclusivity. That is to say, we can see the landscape of virtue, but we can also see a landscape that is fraught. And that we are in a process of balancing between these two landscapes, where we're not denying the truth of suffering. By the same token, we're not just sitting in, sort of the world of positive psychology and virtue, but we understand that our human lives and our character embrace a much wider territory, one that is more complex and in a way more rich.
It's interesting, because I think that's part of what is that internal struggle for a lot of us, is that recognition of, to me, the image that you were painting there is the wholeness of what it is that is really visible and can be seen. Part of what I know that you express in the book is that sense of, we can either be almost buried within the suffering, or we can be freed from the suffering, but both are us. It's still, the whole picture is who we are. And at any given time, navigating that path. The 5 edges that you discuss in the book, for everybody: altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. I was curious, how did you arrive at those 5?
Well, I have been working with not only clinicians for many decades, but with educators and people in the business sector, and politicians and human rights activists and people involved in humanitarian work. And so I've had the opportunity to actually bear witness to a lot of suffering, a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges, not only that all these people face, including parents, but also that I have faced as well. And originally I identified just the fraught side, if you will, of these virtues. But I began to see, as the vision of this work began to develop, the power of the entire spectrum, and from, virtue to difficulty. And that when we encounter difficulties, actually is the sort of turning point where character can develop. So it's not to say you have to look for problems. Don't worry, problems will find you. It's much more to understand that to sit in the virtue of respect, for example, is really important. If whether you're a business leader, a politician, or a parent, whether you're a patient, for example, who is suffering from a catastrophic illness, if you treat your caregivers disrespectfully, that will affect the quality of their work. If you're a teacher feeling fraught, or if you're a student who feels disrespected, then extraordinary difficulties can arise. So what I've tried to do is to, after distilling a tremendous amount of experience that I have been privy to in working with so many different kinds of people over the years, first I wanted to identify the territories, the edges that I felt were important for us as we look into the future. In fact, there are many more edge states, but I tried to pick the 5 that I felt were the most important for us to explore. And I'd done a fairly deep analysis, surfacing, explication, exploration of each of these edge states. As you say, altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement, and their fraught sides, pathological altruism, empathic distress, moral suffering, disrespect, and burnout. And these are, by the way, the fraught sides are not unfamiliar to most of us. So, but what I discovered, fascinatingly enough, Luke, and this was, I think, very important, in another piece of work that I was engaged in, which was doing this mapping of compassion and really redefining what compassion is in terms of it being a complex dynamical system and an emergent process in that system. I discovered that compassion is actually the medium that can transform any of the fraught aspects of these edge states into their positive side.
Interesting. Okay, so that obviously is, then I'm curious about that. How does that work? Meaning, what is it about the nature of compassion that brings us out of that fraught state and steps us more into the virtuous state?
Well, because compassion involves a number of experiences or processes, including our capacity to really attend to what is happening in this moment, to attend to the suffering of others. It involves attentional balance, being grounded, being able to allocate our attention to what's happening right in front of us in relation to suffering. It also involves prosocial aspects of our own mental continuum, including our capacity for concern for others and kindness, sympathy, the sense of connection, respect, integrity. All of these are, and also appreciation, gratefulness. There's a huge spectrum of prosocial qualities. You cannot be compassionate without having basic prosociality. And it also involves intention. That is our capacity to, what I could say, to be morally sensitive, and as well to have the moral nerve, the strong back to actually sit in the charnel grounds of suffering. And it involves insight as well. And I can say much more about that. I know we don't have time, but I won't now. But anyway, insight and the last feature that I've mapped out in this particular piece of work I did, actually at the Library of Congress, where I was a distinguished visiting scholar. And so I could really get down in the work there. The last feature is embodiment, and then there's a lot to be said about that, but later. But in any case, what I realized was that this suite of capacities, all of which are trainable, prime capacity, the capacity of compassion to emerge. So it's wonderful. And then I realized, and this is some years ago, that in fact applying these same qualities to the experience, for example, of pathological altruism, or bringing compassion, as I describe it, in relation to empathic distress, or to disrespect or moral suffering or burnout, transforms the more fraught aspects of the edge states and brings them back into strength and balance.
Let me ask you, because it seems that, the conversation around compassion is certainly one that thankfully is emerging more and more right now. And whether that's from the spiritual side as well as the scientific side, there's some very interesting things that seem to be coming out right now. That said, it seems, or one could certainly believe, that compassion is something that we seem to struggle with as a society, that ability to show compassion, that ability to seek the understanding of others is something that we seem to struggle with. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what it may be that seems to be this resistance at times to be compassionate to others, to look to what another person is going through as opposed to solely our view of the world or what it is that we may want from a circumstance.
Well, we many of us refer to this experience of compassion deficit. Actually, Luke, yes, there is a deficit of compassion in the lives of many people and in certain institutions. But I would also say there's actually an increase of compassion in the world. And we see this, for example, in the life of someone like Nicholas Winton, who died at the age of 106, but who saved, 669 children from going to the death camps in Eastern Europe. Wesley Autry, the Afro-American man who jumped off the platform of the subway when this young man was having a seizure on the tracks as the subway was heading toward him, and Leslie Autry just jumped off and kept this man from being killed. We see so many extraordinary acts of compassion in the world, including, yesterday or day before yesterday, when the football coach, assistant football coach, took bullets and was killed in order to protect the students. So in this Florida school where this terrible shooting just happened. So my actual perspective is that there's a lot more compassion than many of us would suppose, because I think that, we're exposed to so much negative media that we are under the assumption, we actually believe, in a way it's kind of fake news, we believe that there's a serious compassion deficit in the world, when in fact I think that there's more compassion in the world today than at any other time in the history of humanity.
So much of what we do from week to week on One Idea Away are explore different ideas and insights and stories that I can tell you have personally and professionally affected my own life and my own career. I also know that these are the ideas and the insights that have affected many others, people that I've worked with, from actual direct clients of mine to coaches that I know that are out there that are doing this work, to obviously the work and the stories that so many of our experts and guests share right here on the show. And so we've begun some new things new developments inside of the One Idea Away community. And you might be missing out on some of these added reflections and insights that we've been doing, as well as some of the deeper conversations we're getting into. So if you are not presently receiving our email messages, or if you're not part of our private Facebook group conversations, then I'm going to ask you to get involved so that you're not missing out on some of the weekly momentum building reflections and questions that we keep throwing out, some of the inspiration and encouragement of the community, because there's really nothing like having somebody in your corner while you're trying to make some of these types of changes. We've even begun some regular live streaming so that we can go deeper into these topics. Just go over to oneideaaway.com/join to get involved. Now, don't worry, it's free. Just jump on in at oneideaaway.com/join. It's part of our mission at One Idea Way to take these insights, the wisdom that's gained, and begin to use them so that we can springboard to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. As I said, these are the ideas and insights that have changed my own lives and the lives of so many more. And if you want to know how exactly, if you want to know how you can begin to tap into some of these ideas and make those shifts within your life, well, do me a favor, just go over to oneideaaway.com/join, get on the email, stop inside of the community, and please come ask me. I would love to have that conversation with you, as well as get you involved to make whatever changes, whatever shifts in your life you're looking to make. Because at the end of the day, it just takes one idea for us to really start to uncover what this life can be all about for us. Thanks for dropping in, and enjoy the rest of the episode. One of the things I want to get to one of your actual your kind of methods of breaking out of that empathetic distress of grace, to just chat about that a little bit, because I know how much it relates to this conversation we've already begun. To do that, if you could maybe distinguish, because I think there was some very important distinction between empathy and compassion that you make in the book, and I think that's an important one for people to understand. If you could share that difference.
Sure. Empathy is really important. Our capacity to actually be in physical resonance with another, to be in emotional resonance with another, to be in cognitive resonance with another. But just because we're in resonance doesn't mean that we have concern or that we're going to act on our concern. So, a world without empathy is a world where we're basically dead to each other. Empathy is really important. It has to do with increasing our sense of subjectivity to include the experience of others. This is really fundamental. I mean, this is one of the extraordinary things about humanity, but it also, listen, I've seen empathic elephants and empathic dolphins, empathic rats. So it's not just a human feature. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to feel concern just because we're empathic, or that we're going to act on our empathy in order to transform suffering. In fact, clearly a psychopath who's able to really sense into another person's experience and uses it in order to harm them is a person who has empathy but not have concern. So we have to, that distinction between empathy and compassion is interesting to note. It's important. Sometimes in compassion, there's a high degree of empathy. Sometimes there's very little empathy. But what compassion does or entails is our capacity to really attend to another and to want to benefit another who's suffering. And usually it involves empathy, but not always.
Sure. And I think it was interesting in terms of, and again, you described the edge states in this manner in a multitude of ways, but with empathy, that there is that sort of that balance that we try to maintain, as it were, of how it is that we can connect and pick up on and understand subjectively the experience of another, but not allowing it to go too far to the point where it's distress. Whereas with compassion, compassion is sort of limitless. We can give it and give it and give it and give it, and we're always going to have more.
Luke, I want to thank you for reading my book. I'm very grateful because, sometimes I'm interviewed and I realize the person's not even opened the book to, read the summary, and you actually studied it. So yep. I thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And you nailed it. Exactly. You said it perfectly. Thank you.
One of those things that you bring up is that if we do tip over, as it were, and we get into that place of empathetic distress, you bring up it was a mnemonic and a beautiful one at that of grace. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that idea of grace and how you mean it, because I think this is one of those things that it struck me as this is one of those elements that not only would help us with empathetic distress, but because of the way that all of these 5 virtues are so well connected, this can help us in many, many different ways.
Wonderful. Well, Luke, as you know from reading the book, thank you so much. One of the things I did at the library was to do a heuristic mapping of compassion. And which, when I was doing this work, I realized all of the qualities that prime compassion are trainable. And then I realized what I wanted to do was to actually create a process that is sort of in your back pocket, something that a clinician or a parent or a teacher or a patient, something I use a lot in the different kinds of work that I do, could use in vivo, that is in the moment of when we're interacting with someone, which is really important. It's not that we sit at home, we do the practice, and then it's going to happen. This is actually in vivo, in our lived experience. And so I created this mnemonic, which brings the main features of compassion together. And the mnemonic is grace. And the G stands for gathering our attention. Getting grounded. The R stands for recalling our intention. And it's really touching into the ethical base of why we're here and what we want to do. It's about moral character and moral sensitivity, and it's about also moral nerve, our capacity to really have a strong back and a soft front. The A of grace is for attunement, and that is our capacity first to attune to ourselves, because our body, where we begin, this attunement process is holding a tremendous amount of information. And so the first level of attunement that we engage in is somatic or physical attunement. We see what is the body telling us about being in this particular situation. We do affective attunement. What's our emotional our emotional experience right now? And then we attune to what kind of thoughts, what view is present, what biases are present. And then we open to attune to another physically, emotionally, and mentally. And we are in that experience of resonance. This can happen in an instant, but excuse me, when we train people, we train them very carefully in each of these 6 domains of attunement. And then from that, that's the A of grace. And the C of grace is consider what will serve. So from attentional balance, from recalling our intention, from self and other attunement, we use insight, inquiry as a way to really see, what's going to serve this person. We can look from the perspective of 37,000 feet systemically. We can look at, what is needed for this person within a system, within a family system, a hospital system, a school system. We take that kind of pause that allows us for the kind of wisdom to arise. So we're not just, operating out of the physician's desk reference, but, we're allowing both kind of a fast thinking and slow thinking process to arise. And then the E of grace, Luke, is engagement. What is the action then we're going to take based on insight?
And what struck me is exactly where you began with this, which is that this is one of those processes for in the moment, something
Yes.
that you really can truly be there in the life situation that you happen to be in. And I think that's one of the things that, certainly is one of the ideas that I love being able to bring out on a show like this, because there's a lot of practices that we can do that prepare us for the day and for those moments, but they're done at different times, reflective times for us. And then there are the where the rubber meets the road moments. Yeah. And this is one of those processes that helps really bring that out. I think one of the other edges, since we only have a half an hour, we can't get to all of them as much as I would love to. One of the other edge states that struck me, which is a really interesting one, was around that edge of respect. And I guess the reason why it stuck out to me is that, with some of the maybe organizations that I've worked with, some of the clients that I've coached at different times, some of the struggles that I've seen people have, is that idea of respect can get kind of intertwined with that ego, as it were, the cultural definition of ego, and how respect can almost even be treated as something that's transactional. Of you've got to earn my respect for me to be able to give you respect. And I'm just curious if you could speak more to helping us understand what do you really mean, what really is respect, what it is not, so that people can really understand what's at the heart of this. What do we really truly mean by respect?
Yeah, as I understand respect, it involves 3 different aspects. And, one of those is respect of others. That's holding others in kind regard, if you will. Another is respect for ourselves, self-respect, which is, rather obvious. People who don't have self-respect have certain behaviors and self-attitudes that are destructive. And then the third is respect for principles and values that engender well-being in the world. And so, these are the 3 aspects of respect that I think are really critical for us to explore. I explore, as you know, in the book deeply, the whole sort of spectrum of respect. Yeah. And I focus in the book, Luke, just to shift the question a little bit, sure, on an issue that has become, more and more problematic in our world today, and that is of bullying, of bullying among peers, which is called horizontal hostility, and bullying on a vertical axis, which is called vertical violence, which can be bottom up. That is, say a patient bullying a clinician, a student bullying a teacher bullying a patient, a teacher bullying a student, or a physician bullying a patient, or this sort of culture of disrespect is something I think is really important for us to address in the world today. So I try to do a deep exploration in the book of how disrespect has emerged, as a more a vivid problem in our world today, and some of the pathways back to holding each other, ourselves, and the principles and values that are important about what it is to be a good human being. Hold those in regard.
It's interesting because what also in that section, that portion, which stood out to me, which is something that definitely spoke to me as well and really resonated with me, is that when we look behind that word respect, because that respect is a great word that brings these other concepts together, was that sense that when we're looking for respect from others or from ourselves, that there's a certain recognition, a certain love that we're looking for, a certain appreciation we're looking for, that idea of feeling valued and even being seen by others and seen for who we truly are. It embodies so much of these things. And I think that's part of that dissection of respect for others, respect for self, that I'm hoping people continue to look into, to really understand exactly, as you said, that spectrum of respect and everything that goes behind it, so that we really understand what are we actually after when we use this word respect. What are we really looking for? Because there's such depth of human nature that drives us, that really is underneath that. One of the other things, just before we bring things around, because I do have kind of one big question I wanted to ask you on something. But before we do, you raised earlier in the book, but it was applicable to all of the edges, about 3 specific tenets that could be used to really kind of navigate and support us on this journey. The tenet of not knowing, bearing witness, and compassionate action. If we could just for a moment talk very briefly just about these 3. I'm curious, when you say not knowing, how is this not knowing one of these kind of skillful ways of us really kind of developing how we work with these virtues?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Luke. And of course, our whole conversation has been filled with knowing, but never mind. But it's more that when we're in an encounter with an individual, or where we find ourselves in a situation that is fraught or super positive, we have a kind of openness, a sort of curiosity. There's a sort of interest. We're not operating from our biases or being propelled by even unconscious biases into reactions that are distorted and could potentially cause harm. So this not knowing for me, which I learned from my beloved teacher, Bernie Glassman, and I was working as a volunteer inside a maximum security prison in the state of New Mexico. And let me tell you, I really got what not knowing was about. And I, was sitting there with a death row prisoner and trying to create, sort of foster an authentic connection. And realizing, oh gosh, how many scripts were operating in my head at the same time? How many biases? And, you could say, I would say now, it was all fake news. It's ultimately all fake news. It's just your opinion. And in order to have an authentic relationship, it's really to drop deeper than those biases, than the fears, than the scripts, the descriptors, and so forth, and to make direct connection. So not knowing and to be open and curious and just, it's this sense of a path of discovery.
So for these next 2, I don't want you to define them only because it leads to this other question. But these other 2 of bearing witness and compassionate action, let's tie them into this other question, because with your background of kind of where things began with civil rights and the anti-war movement and the very interesting times that we find ourselves in today, where there's a lot to potentially be active about. One of those phrases that I've seen used and something that I've seen people try and figure out is this idea of how to be a spiritual activist, as it were, meaning how is it that we can remain grounded and walk this edge of our spirituality, knowing what it is that we stand for, and at the same time speak out, to be an advocate for change in some capacity. And that strikes me as one of those edge lines that we walk, of how to not go over the edge of that. And I was wondering if you could just share a little from your perspective of what that edge of being a spiritual activist can look like for us.
Well, if we talk about some of the people who do that well, right, like Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, those are, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, we're talking about people who have, whether they're with us now, but they're spirits who are, who integrated spirituality and social responsibility. And I'm sure it was a learning curve in a certain way for all of them. Mandela was in prison a long time, and I remember Archbishop Tutu said of Mandela that he really lacked empathy before he went to prison. So interesting. So, I think these are stellar examples of people who have integrated spirituality and social action. What does it look like? It looks like those people. It probably looks like a lot of people we know.
It's amazing to use such extraordinary individuals, obviously, as the examples that are out there, and be able to ask ourselves what it is that we recognize in them, how it was that they were able to put a voice out into the world, but to do so from a place that was not filled with hate. It was not filled with that outrage, and certainly it was never apathetic. And to be able to look at what some of those traits and qualities are, and to be able to extract from these wonderful examples that we have, and see how we can bring a little bit more of that into our lives. Because I do think it's something that a lot of people are trying to figure out right now, of how to put that voice in the world, but do so in a manner that is very caring and compassionate at the same time.
I think, in the Women's March that we saw this year and last year, we're talking about millions of people.
Yeah.
People, men and women, young people who are living by principles that are generous, that are visionary, and that are courageous.
Yeah. So just to bring us around a little bit full circle, one of the things that this show is meant to do is to begin a conversation, not just to have one, but what is it that continues after our time together? And I guess I'm curious for you, what is it what's the conversation that you're really hoping to stir up in people from the work that you do in the world? What's the conversation you hope that they continue?
Well, I always say to myself, why not now? Why not me? What's holding me back? And also what's supporting me in bringing the best of my humanity forward, knowing that I have no idea when my life will end. So it's like being able to use my life well in moment by moment. I was quite ill a couple of years ago. I had sepsis and I was hospitalized. And I remember being in the emergency room, and, I had this just completely clear commitment, which was every single person who interacted with me, I was going to make a special effort, even though I was really dangerously ill, to be very, very kind. And I have to tell you, it changed my experience as a patient. Why not?
Yeah. I love that. Roshi Joan, I just want to thank you for coming on the show today, sharing your time, your wisdom, and just thank you for the work that you're doing in the world.
Well, I'm so moved that you read the book, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom, Where Fear and Courage Meet. And I'm excited it's coming out May 1st. And it was powerful to write because I learned so much in the unfolding, just like origami. I kind of unfolded a world step by step, and learned so much, just as, interacting with you has given me that same feeling.
Thank you, Roshi Joan. Again, everybody, that was Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet. Really, it's filled with these wonderful virtues, some incredible stories, and also some incredible tools to help you navigate what that edge is. And so just to leave us today, I don't know if I can frame it any better way than for you to consider, why not now and why not me? So reflect on those. And when you stop in on us next time, I look forward to serving you then as well. And until that next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.